Okay, welcome everybody to our class on the Haggadah, on the Pesach Seder, which is this Friday night is Seder 1, and Saturday night is Seder number 2. And it all depends, if you're from Israel, if you're in Israel, some will only do one Seder, but here in the diaspora, many of us we all do two Sedarim. And we're going to talk tonight about the meaning of the Seder. There's so much in the Seder. I remember hearing there was a joke, a story of a rabbi about 100, 200 years ago. He came back from Israel to Europe, and they said, "What'd you think?" He said, "I loved it there." He says, "Everyone, when I ask them how they're doing, they all say Hakol Beseder, Hakol Beseder, that everything's okay." But he was a Hasidic Rebbe, and he said he took the words Hakol Beseder, and he said, Hakol, everything, is Beseder. It can be found in the Pesach Seder. In the Seder that we do, there's so many secrets of what Judaism's all about that's encapsulated in the Seder and that we can uncover on the Seder night, this Friday night. What does Pesach Seder actually mean literally? Pesach means, anybody? You can type it in the chat box. Anybody know what Pesach comes from? Or you can unmute yourself. Pesach means to jump. Pesach means to leap. It's when God leaped over the Jewish homes during the death of the firstborn plague. Seder, what does that mean? It means the complete opposite of jumping, of crazy leaping. It's order, orderliness, step by step. So why do we have a paradox? Why do we have two opposite things here? Pesach Seder means orderly jumping, because that's the whole idea of the Seder. It's 15 steps of how to leap to a transcendent place, but you were doing it through structure. And that's really what Jewish life is all about. How do I reach a transcendent high place, but doing it by doing it through a structure, through an ordered way? That's what mitzvot are, that Judaism is so obsessed with all the details of what to do here and there, all the little things that we're supposed to do. It's not to limit us. It's to help us reach very high places. But to leap, you can't just have a momentary leap. That you'll jump, you can have high moments in life. But if you want it to last, if you want to really reach high places, it has to be rooted in a step-by-step intentional process. So and that's really, by the way, the next 7 weeks. We'll need another class for this. But the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, that path to reaching the Torah is through counting the Omers, through working on harmonizing and balancing our emotional traits to reach transcendence, which is the 50th day of Shavuot, which can't be counted. 7 times 7 is 49. That we do on our own. The 50th, the transcendent, the leaping, we can't do more. That's a gift from God that we get, the Torah. Now, Pesach night, we know, is V'yigarat levincha, that the whole point of the Seder is to give it over to your children, is to educate those at your table. It's really an outward-facing holiday. It's not just, it's about us growing and connecting, but it's about others. There's a beautiful story I heard where this lady came to, I think it was Rabbi Moshe Brisker. It was a big rabbi about 200 years ago, and she asked him a question. She said, I think her question was this. She said, I don't have money for wine for the Seder. Can I use 4 cups of milk for the Seder instead? So he said, don't you worry. We'll get you money for the wine. And he asked his students, they give him money, but he asked for a huge sum of money. And he gets the money, gives it to her, and she goes home. And the students said, Rabbi, why so much? She just needed a little bit. She needed wine. She was missing wine. He said, no, the fact that she asked, could I use milk, means that, of course, she doesn't have meat either, because you can't have milk and meat at the same table. So she doesn't have meat. If she doesn't have meat, she probably doesn't have vegetables. She doesn't have food. She's just trying to ask for a minimum thing. And the lesson from that story is to hear behind the questioner. We're always listening to, as a man, we get questions, we want to answer it immediately. It's listening behind the question. What's really going on? The sensitivity to that question. And Pesach is really about providing the needs for ourselves and for our guests and for people around us to have what they need for the Pesach Seder. The main things we need are the matzahs, ideally shmura matzah. We need 4 cups of wine. We need the Seder plates. And let's discuss what goes on the Seder plate. So I have a little picture here this doesn't really do justice to the thing. You know what, for those that are on the computer, I'm going to share my screen briefly so you can look at what goes on the Seder plate. The Seder plate, okay, so the Seder plate's like this. It has a shank bone, which is a bone from an animal, which connects to the Korban Pesach. It represents the sacrifice that we used to bring in the temple. On the left front, you have the egg. We're going to explain the meaning behind all this stuff in a second. In the middle, we have the maror, which is the bitter herb. On the bottom right, we have charoset, which is the sweet. Now, by the way, in this picture on the computer, there's different versions. I'm doing the Chabad Hasidic version. Bottom right, we have charoset, which is a sweet either apple or cinnamon mix there. Then we have on the left, bottom left, karpas, which is sometimes used as celery or onions. And then at the bottom, we have chazeret, which is usually lettuce. And on top of that, we have also some more maror. Then we have 3 matzot underneath, and then the plate. And according to Kabbalah, the 6 on the top correspond to the 6 sfirot: Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. And then the 3 matzot correspond to Chachma, Bina, Dat, which you may have heard of, the intellectual, or some say, Chachma, Bina, Dat. Dat being the top matzah, then Bina, and then Chachma. And then the bottom plate itself corresponds to Malchut, the final one of the Sfirot that it's known as the receiver, that receives from the other ones. And that's why every aspect of the Seder and the plates is meticulous, methodical. I'm not going to go into all the details, but let's do a little touch on the Sfirot. The zro'ah, the arm, the shank bone represents chesed, giving. An arm gives forward, is loving kindness. It gives out, is outstretched arm that God used to take us out of Egypt. And by the way, you can focus on one of these sfirot during the Seder. Like, we're going to talk a lot tonight about how the night of the Seder is about breaking through your limitation and taking something that you want to break free from, something you want to grow the most in. Focus on that, turn to Hashem, and this is a time to tap into that energy to bring it all down. The egg is gevura, is discipline. It represents also the destruction of the temple. What we'll talk, because an egg in Judaism, we use it when we mourn things because it's circular, showing how life goes around and around. The maror represents tiferet, which is compassion, empathy, because it's bitter, and bitter, you feel the tears, you feel the pain of another, and the pain of the Jewish people in Egypt. The charoset represents also the mortar. It represents the oppression that the Jewish people were under, but the oppression also made them stronger. They proliferated, they endured, they pushed through. So charoset is netzach, is the attribute of endurance, of ambition, of victory, of perseverance. The bottom left is karpas, which is the hod, which represents humility. And that is karpas, onions and leeks and things like that. They grow low to the ground. And we know that hod is about humility and that ability to be meek in the right time, in the right way. Chazeret, which is again the bitter herbs, is connected to yesod, which is bonding, connecting to another. And to be honest, if you want to be able to connect to another person, you have to be able to feel the need and the lack that you have, and the need of connecting to the other and understanding what they need as well. And again, the chazeret is used in the sandwich, in the Hillel sandwich. And the sandwich is again the idea of bonding and connecting two things together. Then we have the 3 matzot, which also correspond to Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. And finally, we have Malchut, which is the plate itself, which it's empty. It's like David HaMelech. It's the idea of nobility and reception and expression, and it receives from the rest, kind of like the moon, right? The Jewish people are likened to the moon. The moon reflects the light of the sun, and the plate represents that as well. So let's go into quickly through the stages of the Seder. I'm going to show you the 15 steps. Anybody know the song? Kadesh or Chatz. We won't do it all now. I'm going to share on the screen for those who want to see. We have Kadesh, which we make Kiddush on the wine. We have Urchatz, where we wash our hands without a blessing. We just wash our hands, because before you have any type of vegetable that's wet or anything, you're supposed to wash your hands for that too. We don't really know that, but it is a thing. Karpas, which is what we talked about, taking a small piece of this onion or this potato. So a lot of people use potato for that. And we dip it in the salt water. Then we have yachatz, where we break the matzah, the middle matzah, in half, and we save the bigger piece we take for the afikomen. Chabad minhag is to break it into 5 pieces, but we take the bigger part of that middle matzah and we save it for later. Magid is when we tell the story, the Haggadah, the famous Haggadah. Rachza is when we wash our hands, this time with a blessing, so that we can eat the matzah soon after. Motzi is when we take the 3 matzot together and we make we focus on the 2 full matzahs mainly. We make a blessing on it and we eat it. And remember, when we eat the matzah and when we drink the wine, we recline to our left. Fun fact, if you're in front of your teacher, you have to ask permission. That's a one-time of respect. But in your houses, you recline to your side. And then we have the maror, the matzah, and then the maror. We take a little bit of the charoset, but mainly the bitter herbs, and we eat the maror to remind ourselves of the bitterness. Then we have korech, which is when we make a sandwich, and we eat a little bit of the charoset with the maror and the matzah. And then shulchan aruch. Then we have our meal. Then we get to enjoy. My dad's joke every year is when we do all these steps of the maror before we get to the meal. He's like, "Thank you everybody for coming. All the best." And people who don't know the Seder are a bit shocked because there's no food yet. It's just been some bitter herbs. Then we have a delicious meal. And then we do the tzafun, which is when we have the afikomen. And then we make another blessing on wine. We make birkat hamazon, the grace after meals, and we say Hallel, we sing, and nirtza. We finish off the Seder. Okay, let's get into it. Now that we got through some of the steps. First of all, just briefly, what is the symbolism of what's on the Seder plate also practically? So wine, we have wine at almost every major Jewish occasion because wine is one of the few physical substances in all of reality that gets better over time, that ages well, right? Physical things usually don't age better over time. Spiritual things get better over time. What are examples? Your wisdom, hopefully your character growth. Like we tend to get a little calmer as we get older. We work on ourselves. Things that are of true spiritual value get better over time. So wine represents that. It also is inside the grape. It's hidden inside the grape. And the Talmud says that nichnas yayin yotze sod, that when wine comes in, the secrets come out. We know that yayin is 70 in numerical equivalent, gematria, and secret is also 70. There's some connection to ingesting wine and connecting to secrets. If you have too much, it's not a good idea. But having wine in moderation in the right holy context can be very elevating to those that can do that. Of course, you have to know yourself. We have 4 cups of wine. They're very important to have 4 cups of wine to try to fill, and not just little shot glasses, but a decent amount. It doesn't have to be a huge cup, and we recline and we drink it. And this is a night of freedom, and not just freedom physically, but freedom spiritually. So remember that as we're going through all these steps and connecting, we want to make sure that we take moments out of the evening to close our eyes, to not think so much, and to just feel the connected to God. Say, God, I want to be free of whatever is holding me back from manifesting my inner potential greatness. That is what we're going after in this evening, even if I don't understand it. There's a beautiful story. I think it's this Rebbe, this holy tzaddik. He sees one of his Hasidim on Pesach in his shul, and he sees like a light shining from him. So he says, "Tell me what you did during the Seders." So he's like, okay. I mean, he said, first night was great. I had all the proper intentions, all the Kabbalistic intentions behind every single detail of the Seder. And I sang my heart out for hours. And I told the story to my children, and we had a lovely meal, and it was peaceful. And I went through the whole night. We finished at like 4 a.m, and it was just incredible. It was such an all-nighter, though, that when I went to take a nap the next day, I told my family to wake me up before the Seder, and they didn't. They let me sleep. And I woke up, and it was almost midnight. And according to some very stringent opinions, especially the first night, you want to make sure you have the afikomen before midnight. But second night, it's not, I don't think, such a thing. But he wanted to, that was his thing. I have the afikomen before midnight. He's like, what am I going to do? It's like 20 minutes until midnight. I haven't even started the Seder. So he rushed, opposite of the first night. He rushed through the whole thing. And what was he said, my intention was simply, God, thank you for taking us out of Egypt to be free, to serve you and to connect with you. And he just had like a simple intention for the Seder. And he told the story of leaving Egypt. And the Rebbe said in like a sing-song voice that Mendel's first night was he did everything properly, but the second night is where he drew down the greatest light. Now there's something powerful about doing a mitzvah simply because Hashem asks it of us and with simple faith in the story that it is. And that's the beauty of children. That's the beauty of the inner child, because we think that Pesach is tell it to your children and not to us, but it's also talking about the child within yourself. You know, that pure place within you that's always wondering about things. It's internally curious and is looking to learn and grow and understand. So it's good for us to have intention with everything we're doing, but it's also good to have kind of a simple focus on what Pesach is about freedom, about telling the miracles of what happened. After the wine, we talk about the karpas. The karpas is interesting. It's the same word that's used for Yosef's coat. Karpas also means like a soft material. So one of the other lessons that karpas teaches us is to remember why we ended up in Egypt in exile in the first place. The brothers were jealous of Yosef. He had a special coat that was given to him by his father, and they dipped it in blood and they sent him down to Egypt. That led to the exile in Egypt to begin with. So one of the steps of leaving your own Egypt is to know what got you there and to be aware of how darkness starts and getting out of it. Another major focus of the Seder plate is the salt water. We dip all the time in salt water. We try to remind ourselves of the tears, but there's a big difference between pain and suffering. Pain happens all the time in many ways, but suffering is pain without a good meaning to your pain. That's what suffering is. The Kabbalists explain that the reason human beings close their eyes when they're in pain is because our physical eyes don't see a spiritual purpose behind what's happening to us. And when a person closes his eyes or even squints, squinting your eyes is to help you. Why do we squint? We squint to look at something far away. So the more you close your eyes to see in a spiritual distance, to see that there's a reason behind the pain that's happening in our lives. And we dip the karpas into salt water to embody this idea of purposeful suffering, that there's suffering that's happening for a reason. Egypt is happening to get us to Mount Sinai and to Israel, that everything is happening to guide us. And that's one of the ideas behind karpas. Maror, the bitterness of maror. It's interesting that the Jewish people, we don't have a ministering angel that protects us. Every nation has an angel that protects them. The Jewish people, we only have God, it says. On the one hand, it's a problem because when we run away from God, we distance from God, there's no backup. There's no like special angel. We end up being the weakest people in the world. But when we attach ourselves to God, we're the strongest. No one can touch us. The egg and the shank bone, the last two I'm going to talk about of the plate, represents the two sacrifices. The egg is the chagiga offering, and the shank bone is the paschal lamb offering. Also, the matzah is connected to that. And in Judaism, we always recall the destruction of the temple, even in our happiest of times, right? Even at a wedding, even on Pesach. And what's interesting is the sages who are the major part of the Haggadah, that era of sages, we're going to talk about them in a second, they lived at the end of the destruction of the second temple and after the destruction of the temple. And it's interesting that the first night of Pesach every year will always come out on the same day of the week of Tisha B'Av, of the 9th day of Av, of the destruction of the both temples. It'll always come out on the same time. So there's a connection between Pesach and the destruction of the temple, and of course, the redemption as well. Underneath the plate, we said, are the matzahs. Matzah is flat, it's simple. Bread, chametz, which we have to destroy on Passover, that we reject, that we avoid, is matzah that's been in the oven longer and has grown and puffed itself up. It represents, we know this, ego. Destroying chametz is not to burn off carbs. It is to burn away self-serving ego. That on Pesach, we have the ability to go past our selfish, limited thinking. And we can say, you know what? I want to do more for others. I want to do more for my soul. And these moments of matzah moments, these moments of pure faith, of liberation of the soul, is the greatest joy for that deeper part of ourselves. And if you notice the matzah, the way it's shaped, the letters, and the chametz, it's the same letters, except for the chet of chametz and the hey for matzah. Because the hey of matzah, the hey has an opening on the top and an opening on the bottom. Humility allows yourself to open yourself up, to learn from others, to know when you're wrong, to know how to grow, to get better, and to give to others and to be open. Chametz, the chet, ego, arrogance, is closed off. It's not open to receiving. I know everything. I can't learn from others. I can't learn from God. I can't learn from Torah. So the goal is to move from a chametz reality on Pesach to a matzah reality in that respect. And there's a deep idea. It's long, but I like to shorten things and just give you a taste of what we're trying to say here. And hopefully, something is gained from that. Why do we have 3 matzahs and 4 cups of wine? The 4 cups of wine we know correspond to the 4 times God said, I will redeem you from Egypt. It corresponds to a lot of things, as do the 3 matzahs. But Hasidic teachings say that wine is very full. It's very tasty. It's developed. It's nuanced. It's rich. It's full of taste and texture. Matzah is flat and plain and just not. What does that represent spiritually? Matzah represents simple faith, pure faith. It's a very deep thing, but it's also not very nuanced. It's not like you have to think a lot to have faith in Hashem. It's just a reality that your deeper self is in touch with. And we could have a whole class on faith. Faith is not what we think faith is in English, which is like this blind belief system. No, it's not that. It's a super rational connection that your soul has and is aware of God at all times that you can tap into. But at the end of the day, it's flat. Wine represents our intellects. It's our understanding. Understanding is very rich. Like when you spend hours to understand a deep idea and you integrate it into yourself and you make it one with you and you understand all the details of it, it's like a broadness of your whole personality. It's very rich. So what's the goal? Which one's better? Raise your hand for matzah. Raise your hand for wine. Not which one you like more, what it represents. So here's the idea. The goal is to start off with matzah, then have wine, and then end with matzah. Meaning, you start with faith, but the goal is never to be a child your whole life. Yes, you want to, they say there's an idea of praying as a child. Even the greatest sages wanted to pray like a child. But you don't want to remain a child. You want to learn. You want to grow. You want to spend your whole life growing and becoming more developed and full and rich of personality, of growth, of understanding. That's wine. You want to have wine in your life. It's integral. You have to. But ultimately, you want to reach matzah beyond the wine, which is now that you've learned so much and you've grown so much, there's one level past that, which is a faith that says, I can only go so far, and I know God transcends my mind, transcends all that I've worked on, and I want to connect it there. It's a humble awareness that I've taken it far, and I'm going to continue to take as far as I can, but at the same time, I know that, like one of the sages, I think it's Rebbe Rashab, he says, trying to understand God fully is like trying to grasp a thought with your hands. What if you have really big hands? What if you have really strong muscles? Is that going to help you grab a thought? No. That you can try and you can grow and you can do your best, but it's a humility of acknowledging that Hashem, I'm connected to you even when I don't understand, especially when I don't understand. So that's one of the kavanot, one of the intentions we want to have during the Seder, is that I am connecting myself up to a higher reality that I can't fully, and I don't want to be able to fully, right? To understand God is to be God. If you fully understood, that would be a total limitation to who Hashem is. Imagine a 5-year-old child trying to understand a 70-year-old philosopher of the highest order. It's not from a lack of effort. It's just another dimension of reality, and we can grow there. Okay, what I want to do now is, there's so much to talk about with the Haggadah, because we've gone through the Seder plates. What we want to do is now we want to go into the Haggadah, which is the next part, the stories. And for me, what I find most fascinating is actually the biographies of the rabbis that we speak about in the Haggadah, the ones who wrote the Haggadah. For me, that they are the most fascinating, fascinating lives that you can possibly imagine. And I want to share the screen here where you can see. For those of you who are on here, message me. We can get you onto the live classes every week where you can have access to the text as well. Here we go. Can everybody see? So the Haggadah says like this. It happened that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon were reclining at a Seder in Bnei Brak. It's really cool to hear about cities 2,000 years ago that still exist now today. They were discussing the exodus from Egypt all night long until their students came and told them, "Our masters, the time has come to recite the morning Shema." Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second on that. Who were these rabbis? Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, who were they? Brief summaries into who they were. Going back to the times of the end of the Second Temple, there was we know about Hillel and Shammai, right? We even have the Hillel sandwich. The Hillel is famous. Hillel says, if I am not for myself, who will be for me, right? If not now, when? He said the famous quotes that we have from Hillel. Hillel and Shammai. Hillel had 70 top students. I think the greatest was Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, who you can go to his grave near Tzfat. And I don't think he was married. And if you go to he prays for you, he will intercede for you to get married. Many people go. And they say that when he used to learn Torah, any bird, this is very sad for the birds, but any bird that flew over his head would get incinerated from the fire that would go from his body up to Shemayim, to heaven, it says. And there's many amazing stories about him. He was number one. I think the last of the 70 students, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, became the leader of the next generation, just to give you an idea of how great every generation was. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when there was a rebellion by the Jewish people against the Romans, he could see that the end was near. And he pretended to have died. And his students, who we just mentioned, some of those students took him in a coffin. They took him out of the city and they brought him to the Roman general. And there's a whole story about how the first thing he told the general was, "Praise be the Caesar," or the emperor. And the general said, "I should have you killed twice. One, for not coming earlier to see me and letting these rebels fight for so long, our army. And two, for calling me Caesar. I'm not. I'm just a general. How dare you, say that about our leader?" And at that moment, a messenger came in and said, "The Caesar has died, and you're now the leader of Rome." So when he saw how great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai really was, he gave him a wish. He gave him 3. He didn't ask for Jerusalem to be saved, and some say that's because he knew that wasn't on the table. But one of the things he asked for was that his yeshiva, that his rabbis, and that all the students and the Jewish people be allowed to continue learning Torah, even if Jerusalem's destroyed, in the city of Yavne. And it was granted, and the yeshiva continued in Yavne, another city in Israel. I think I've been there. Okay, now who were these sages that we're talking about? So, and by the way, one more thing, in Yavne, just to give you an idea of what they accomplished there, they put together the Seder. The prayer service that we have is the Amidah, and the prayer service is based on what they put together. We have the idea that every halacha goes, for the most part, like Hillel, not like Shammai. Like, a lot of major principles were developed at that time. Now, who are these major sages? So let's go in order. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was the son of Hyrcanus, right? Ben Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus was a very, very wealthy man at the time, not far from Jerusalem. He was one of the richest Jews of that era. And he had many sons, and one of them was Eliezer, and he made Eliezer work the fields. He didn't want him to go, and Eliezer was very brilliant, and he wanted to learn Torah, but he never did. And in his 20s, one day he decided, that's it, I've had enough, and he left to go to Jerusalem to study. And his father disowned him, and he had no money for food, and he just spent all his time learning Torah. Years later, his father came to Jerusalem. He heard that his son was there, and he went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and said, I want to take my son fully out of my will. This is my intention. He said, okay, in the meantime, I want you to come visit. Come with me, and I want you to hear something. So he brought him, and Rabbi Yochanan invited many sages of Jerusalem to the main study hall. And he asked Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who had now grown into a massive Torah scholar, to teach. And it says his words were so incredible, so full of fire and light, that his father was astonished that this was still his son, the same son. And he took back everything, and he wanted to support him. And he, everything came forward. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is known as, it says here, you know what's the best actually? Let's share a text from Pirkei Avot. Everybody know what Pirkei Avot is? Pirkei Avot is a book from that era that is a collection of, like, when you graduate high school and you get your senior quote. This is the senior quote, lahavdil, of all the greatest rabbis of the time. They got one line that represented who they were, what they wanted to teach. So here's a little bit. This is, okay, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel mehilel mishamayim. Let's do the English. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received the oral Torah tradition from Hillel and Shammai. He used to say, by the way, if you go to his grave in Tiberias, he's buried right next to Maimonides, Rambam. Obviously, he came first, Maimonides later, but it's right near there. And I think this is engraved on his grave. I highly recommend visiting, because there's many of these sages we're talking about are buried next to each other there. And he says like this: if you have learned much Torah, do not claim credit for yourself, because for such a purpose you were created. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, and they were Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. He used to list their outstanding virtues. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is a plastered cistern which loses not a drop. Meaning, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus wasn't necessarily innovating all the new Torah, but he never lost anything from the vast amount of Torah that he learned. He knew thousands of laws for every little detail of Judaism. He knew everything that his teacher taught, backwards and forward. He's like a cistern that doesn't lose a drop. Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, who we're going to talk about in a second, happy is the woman who gave birth to him. I'll explain why. Because his mother used to take him as a baby to the study halls to learn Torah, just to hear Torah. His mother was so dedicated to her son becoming a Torah scholar that she merited that he became one of the greatest. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen is known to be a pious person. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel is one who fears sin. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is like a spring that gathers force. So Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who we're going to talk about as well, he was the opposite of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. He innovated and innovated. What does a spring do that comes from the wellspring? It's always shooting forth new water. So he was so beloved by his teacher in the fact that he was able to always come up with new insights and clarify and ask questions and get further. Sorry if I'm going fast. We just have a lot of material, so we'll just take it in. Rabbi Yochanan used to say, if all the sages of Israel were on one side, on one scale, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was on the other scale, remember, this is a man who didn't even start studying Torah until his late 20s. If the entire Israel was on one scale and Rabbi Eliezer was on the other, he would outweigh them all. Abba Shaul said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, something different. If all the sages of Israel were on one side of the scale, including Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach on the other side, he would outweigh them all. So you see the different importance and beauty of one who could retain information and understand it well. And on the other hand, the power of one who can innovate and come up with new insights as well. And I just want to read you one more Pirkei Avot, the next one, because it gives you a little bit into their personalities. Rabbi Yochanan said to them, go forth and observe what is the right way for a person to connect, to cleave to. What's the best character trait, or what's the best thing to have in your life? Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus said, a good eye, meaning you should look upon people favorably. You should see the good. Rabbi Yeshua said, a good friend, a good companion. Rabbi Yossi said, by the way, that's interesting because Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, he used to fight for the Jewish people against the Romans a lot. Like he would argue and try to plead for them. And one time he heard there was a Jewish captive that was captured by the Romans, and he met the boy, and you could see he was a very special kid, and he gave a big sum of money and he freed him. And that boy became Rabbi Ishmael, which is a Muslim name, but it means God will listen. Yishmael, I guess, was a Hebrew name back then too. And Rabbi Ishmael became the Kohen Gadol. He was incredible. I mean, him and Rabbi Akiva were considered at their time two of the greatest, the fathers of Israel. So this loving kindness of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania and mentoring him raised him into, one of the greatest people who ever lived. And I have Rabbi Yishmael is one of my heroes. So anyways, he says the best thing you can have is a good companion. Rabbi Yossi said the best thing you can have is a good neighbor. We have our neighbors party a lot. It's a nightmare. So it's good to have good neighbors. Rabbi Shimon said, the best thing you can have is foresight. I guess the ability to be aware of what your actions will lead to and what's going to happen in your life. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach said, a good heart. So Rabbi Yochanan said to all of them, I prefer the words of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, for in his words, all of your words are included, right? Having a good heart means, I guess, that you'll probably have a good eye on others. You will make sure to have a good companion. All these things come from it. So then he asked them, find an evil way that a person should shun, push away. And they all chose the opposite. Rabbi Elazar said an evil eye. Rabbi Yossi said an evil friend. Rabbi Yossi said an evil neighbor. Rabbi Shimon said one who borrows and does not repay. For one that borrows it borrows from God. As it says, the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous deal graciously and give. That's interesting. Rabbi Elazar said an evil heart. He said to them, I prefer his words, for in his words, your words are included. Okay, and then each one gives over the things that are their sayings. I'll just give you one because there's too much. Rabbi Eliezer said, let the honor of your friend be as dear to you as your own honor. Do not be easily provoked to anger, and repent one day before your death. Warm yourself before the fire of the wise. So, by the way, what does it mean, repent one day before your death? How are you supposed to know when you're going to die? So he said, exactly, every day. Every day you should try and fix your ways. Before you go to sleep, think about your day. Think about what you're grateful for. Think about what you would have liked to have done differently or what you could fix. Try to cleanse that, and you can go to bed with a clean heart. So it's good to take a stalking whenever you can of that. I actually read last night that Rabbi Nachman says that if you do that for yourself, you judge yourself, again, not in a toxic way, but you're aware of your own, where you could get better. That means you won't have to be judged by anybody else or by Hashem or by any higher thing, because you're doing it to yourself. So I thought that was interesting. As somebody who likes to judge myself a little harshly, I took a little bit of comfort in that. But obviously, we got to find a middle ground. We can't be too hard on ourselves, but we also have to not delude ourselves. We have to be self-aware. Where could I get better? What did I do? Did I yell at that person? Maybe I could be a little more patient next time. Okay, that's Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, we just talked a lot about. He's the one who redeemed the boy from the prison. He's the one who argued for the Jewish people. There's a lot of beautiful stories of him. He was known to be, Rabbi Yishmael was stunningly beautiful, handsome man. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania was not good looking at all. And that's the famous story of one of the Roman general's daughter asking him, how could God put such beautiful wisdom in such an ugly vessel? And he said, look at your father's wine. His wine is in clay vessels. That's disgusting. Why don't you put it in gold vessels? So she did, and it seeped into it, and it made the wine disgusting. And he taught her that when the outer vessel pushes itself forward and tries to overtake what the inner world is, it'll lead to a bad outcome. The outer vessel, the body, the outer world that our culture puts so much emphasis on, is simply there to be a channel for the light of our soul into the world. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer were the major teachers of Rabbi Akiva. Who was Rabbi Akiva? I mean, we could spend a couple hours on Rabbi Akiva. I have his biography here. It's worth a good read by Marcus Lehman. Rabbi Akiva was pretty much arguably the greatest sage that ever existed after Moshe Rabbeinu. Even Moshe Rabbeinu had a vision of Rabbi Akiva and said, God, why don't you give the Torah to him? He's explaining the crowns on the Hebrew letters. I don't even know that. And God said, it's my will that it comes through you. Everything's going to come through you. But Rabbi Akiva, even more than Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, only started learning Torah at 40 years old. His righteous wife, Rachel said, go learn. I'll take care of I want you to become what you can become. And he went for 12 years and studied nonstop. And when he came home, he put his ear to the door and he heard a neighbor berating, saying, how could your husband abandon you like this? He's useless. I can't believe you married him. She said, you know what? If he were to go for another 12 years, I would support him. And without even walking in, he went back and studied for another 12 years. There's an idea of immersion that you can only get through that. And he came back after 24 years with 24,000 students as the greatest sage. And when he came back to his city, his wife was in the back getting pushed out of the way while everybody came to him. And he said, everybody part ways. All that you have from me is due to her, due to Rachel. And he had promised her before he left a golden crown that had the words of Jerusalem in gold around. And they're buried next to each other in Tiberias, not far from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And the stories of Rabbi Akiva are amazing. When his wife said, I want you to go study, and if you don't, I'm not going to marry you, he said, it's too late for me. And he went to the forest, and in the forest nearby, he saw the water dripping on the rock, famous story, the drip on the rock. And he saw this big boulder had a huge crevice in it, just from a drop of water hitting it over years and years and years. And he said, if this weak little drop of water can make a hole in a strong rock through perseverance, then Torah can make it into my brain if I have perseverance and go again and again. And it shows you the power of his will. And he became, massively successful in his studies. Sadly, and this is why during the Omer, it's a bit of a time of mourning after Pesach, his 24,000 students died. It says that they didn't, in a plague, that they didn't show proper honor to each other. And Rabbi Akiva had to start from scratch, build from the ashes of tragedy. And he had 5 major students that ended up building the Jewish people, the learning. It was Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, Rabbi Eliezer ben Shemua, Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous author of the Zohar. And those rabbis most of them taught Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who became the one who wrote the Mishnah. These are all, the Mishnah is the whole Torah that we have, the oral Torah, which is the Talmud, comes from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, all the laws and the way to live a Jewish life comes from Rebbe, who got it from these 5 rabbis, who got it from Rabbi Akiva. And from Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, it says, any Mishnah you read is probably Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Akiva from them. One more famous story with Rabbi Yeshua is that he would have arguments with Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And there's a famous story you may have heard where Rabbi Eliezer tried to convince them. It had to do with an oven, something to do with the kosher aspect of an oven. And he said, if I am correct, let the tree prove it. So they looked out the window and a tree uprooted itself to another place. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah said, we don't decide Torah law based on a miracle of a tree. So he said, if I'm right, let the river prove it. Like, meaning if my approach is the correct Torah divine approach, let's see if God will agree with me. And the river started flowing the other direction miraculously. And Rabbi Yeshua, everyone's shocked. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah said, we don't decide Torah law based on a river. He said, if I'm right, let these walls prove that I'm right. And the walls started caving in, but it stopped halfway out of deference, out of respect to Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah. And a voice came out from heaven and said, not only is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus right in this case, he is right in every case. And you can imagine the rabbis in that room were like, we're going to have to change our opinion. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania got up and he said, Torah lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. And the halacha, the law, went like the majority of the sages, meaning the Torah says you have to go by the majority of the sages. The Torah was given on Mount Sinai, not to the angels, to the people. And if the rabbis decide that this is the majority opinion of what the halacha is, that's what it is. And there's a whole story of I think with a sage, or met Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, and said, what was God doing at that moment? And he said, God was smiling, whatever that means, and saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Banai nitzchuni. Meaning that God agrees with this idea that the Jewish people, the sages, decide, right? Like that's how we decide the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. That the angels wait to hear what do the sages decide for when we bless the new moon. So it's not to be taken lightly, the Torah law that we have. Another of the rabbis in the story of the Haggadah is Rabbi Tarfon. And just a short story of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was, I'll give you one or two. Rabbi Tarfon was very wealthy also. And Rabbi Akiva came to him once and said, give me money that I can invest into something that will never depreciate, that you'll have it forever. So he immediately gave him 4,000 gold coins. And Rabbi Akiva immediately went and gave it to charity, gave it to tzedakah. And when he came back, Rabbi Tarfon said, what did you invest it in? And he said, into tzedakah, into charity, because that will be with you forever. And he kissed him on his head and he said, Akiva, you are my teacher and you are my teacher both in character traits and in Torah. And Rabbi Tarfon was ill, I believe. And his mother came to the rabbis and said, pray for my son. They said, on what merit should we pray for your son? Meaning we know he's great, but give us something to work with. She said, well, one time my sandal broke. And we were about 100 or 200 yards from our home, and instead of me walking barefoot, my son walked on his hands and knees on the floor, so I could walk on his hands to make it home. And what's amazing about the story is, to honor your parents, the sages said that's not even half of the level of honoring your parents is supposed to be. So honoring our parents is a big deal. One of the 10 commandments. I like to tell that story when I'm around teenagers who usually curse out their parents like we all did. And, just to hear that story, a bit shocked. So a little bit about Rabbi Tarfon. And finally, we'll talk about Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, which we mentioned. Sorry, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, if you look at the Haggadah again, it's very interesting what it says. Let's look at it again. For those on the screen. It says like this. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like a man of 70 years old, yet I did not succeed in proving that the exodus of Egypt should be mentioned at night. Okay, what does he mean? I'm like a man of 70 years old. I'm like a man of 70 years old. It's weird. It's a weird language, right? So this is what happened. At that time of all these sages, there was a leader of the whole Sanhedrin named Rabban Gamliel. And he was strict. The temple had just been destroyed, and he felt that if he's not tough, everything's going to go haywire. He had to be very strict. He didn't let too many people into the study hall, only the greatest of the sages. And they had to stand up for him and for the leaders. He had a whole rigid discipline. And at some point, the sages had enough. And they deposed him, and they needed a leader. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was considered the most fitting. He was extremely wealthy, so they knew he couldn't be corrupted. He was brilliant. He had the character trait, he had everything. Problem was, he was only 18 years old. Some say he was even 16, which is shocking. And it says that night that he was elected, a miracle happened, and he grew. We wouldn't find this to be miraculous. This would be the opposite of what we want. But he grew a beard, and it was gray. So it says he almost appeared outwardly older. Why? Because he was afraid, I can't become leader. No one's going to respect a kid. And he made him look old. And that's why he said, I am like a man of 70 years old. I'm like one that is, even though he wasn't. And on that day that he became leader, they opened the doors to the Beis Midrash And it says they added 400 benches to people to sit on and learn. And the amount of novel insights of Torah that happened that day is like legendary. And Rabbi Gamliel, to his credit, sat with everybody humbly and didn't ask any, he just took part as if he wasn't leader. And after a while, they saw that he kind of got it, and they said, okay, you can lead again, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gets to lead for 1 week in the month, and you do the other weeks. And a cool Kabbalistic insight. What does it mean? Just to show you the layers. What does it mean that I am like one of 70 years old? Some say, according to the mystics, that the prophet Samuel, Shmuel Hanavi, he died at the age of 52. And he was reincarnated into Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. At 18 years old, he became leader. 52 plus 18 is 70. So as a reincarnation, it's almost like he was 70 because he took all the wisdom and the connection of his previous incarnation and now. So that's what he meant deeper when he says, I am keben shivim shana, I'm like 70 years old. And it's said about him that the generation in which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lives cannot be considered an orphaned generation. That's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania said. So it's beautiful to see the different qualities of each of these sages. Okay, we're getting towards the end of this class. I want to give you some richness into these sages that we read. You know, in Judaism, we read the Haggadah, we read the laws of life, and we sometimes feel like if you learn about who was giving us the order of the prayers, who was teaching us these nitty-gritty laws, it will give you a lot of inspiration because they were the greatest mystics, Kabbalists. The stories I could tell you for another time about each of these rabbis, what they were like. Rabbi Yishmael knew how to say names of God and ascend to heaven at any moment that he wanted. And there's a whole story because many of these rabbis sadly were killed by the Roman leader of the time. The 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur were these sages. I always like stories, so I want to kind of end off with a story or two. There's a story. I wonder if I could find it actually. Let me look online quickly because I do know it, but I want to say it. I want to do, by the way, while I look it up, if anybody wants to unmute themselves or on here and they want to ask a question or anything about the Seder or about Pesach, feel free. I'm going to read to you the story. Okay, here's the story. This story is told, actually, I'll tell you who it's told by later. And she says like this. One memory never escapes my mind from the times of the Holocaust. In 1941, I had the most extraordinary Passover of my life. I was born, first of all, in the years preceding World War II, and I lived a content life, well loved by my family in Nuremberg. By 1933, my world was getting darker until one day Nazi stormtroopers marched into Nuremberg, ordering that all major buildings must fly the swastika flag by evening. In 1936, my parents took us to Paris as my father had been appointed the rabbi of the prominent Rue Cadet synagogue. Within a few years, the political situation deteriorated and my father was conscripted into the army and left us. In 1940, when the Nazis began bombing Paris, my mother fled with us, her 4 children, on the last train before the onslaught. It was the eve of the holiday of Shavuot. Months later, I had lost track of my family altogether. The story got shortened. Somehow she got separated from her mother. The mass of people on the train was a tornado of humanity, and we were repeatedly wrenched from one another. Months later, on another leg of our journey, I lost track of my family altogether and began to wander from village to village. Lone children all over were doing the same thing. One night just before dawn, I could go no further. I knocked on a farmhouse door of what turned out to be a kind, courageous Gentile farmer. He took me to his cellar where I found another little girl. Eventually, 2 boys and another girl joined us. None of us admitted we were Jewish for several days. It was a dire winter. Each morning, a few rays of light would poke their way into the cellar through 2 windows high on the wall, our only eyes to the world outside. The farmer had lowered us into a cellar through windows, and every day through one of those windows, he lowered a net with 5 morsels of food and a bucket for our natural needs. Strange as it sounds, we were very lucky. In that difficult winter, 5 homeless children developed values so different from those today, as well as a bond of lifelong friendship. One day, peering from the cellar up through the windows, one of us noticed a streak of sunlight in the blue sky. A few days later, we saw blades of grass penetrating the frozen terrain. We had no calendar, we had no sense of time, but we concluded if the weather was changing and it meant spring was on its way, maybe that meant we were nearing Passover. Each of us children came from a different range of Jewish commitment, but we had a strong desire to do something to celebrate what we sensed was the upcoming Passover holiday. When the farmer appeared with our food the next morning, we asked if he would lower tomorrow's basket, with it a small amount of flour, a bottle of water, a newspaper, and a match. 2 days later, we received a small bottle of water, but we had to wait several days for the flour. The entire region was drained of provisions, with everything being transported north to Germany. Our host, the farmer, had himself barely anything to eat. A day later, a newspaper came through and then a match. We waited a few more days. We saw a full day of sunshine and blue skies, and we decided that in order to cultivate a festive spirit, we would switch clothing with one another and wear them as if they were new. So we changed our clothes. The 2 boys traded and the girls exchanged their dresses. Before evening, we baked our matzah, and though we didn't have a clue how to do so, we poured water into the flour and we held the dough in our bare hands over the burning newspaper on the floor. We produced something which resembled matzah, and whatever it was provided enough for the 5 of us. That night, we celebrated Passover. One of us recalled by heart the Kiddush, which is the blessing on Passover night. Another remembered the 4 questions. We told a few stories of the Exodus that we remembered having heard from our parents. Finally, we managed to reconstruct the Chad Gadya song, which usually ends the evening. We had a Passover to remember, with no festive food, no silver candlesticks, no wine, only our simple desire to connect with God. We had a holiday more profound than any we have known since. I thank God for allowing me to live to be able to tell my children and grandchildren about it. Even more, I feel obligated to the younger generations of my family who never experienced what I did, to pass on the clarity it gave me, the vivid appreciation of God's presence in my life, of his constant blessings, wonders, and teachings, and of his commitment to the survival of the Jewish people. And that girl was Lady Amelie Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi of England's wife. She was the widow of Rav Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the chief emeritus of British Commonwealth. She became that leader. So, my friends, I want to wish you a very happy and meaningful Pesach. The founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, his custom was not to say at the end, we have now concluded the Seder, because he felt that spiritually we're not leaving Egypt once a year on the Seder. We're leaving Egypt every day. Every moment of our lives is leaving our limitations, our inner Egypt, whatever's holding us back spiritually, emotionally, mentally. We want to free ourselves with God's help all the time. And may we be blessed this year to be free, not only physically, spiritually, but on the ultimate freedom with the coming of Mashiach. And we should have redemption now.